guys, welcome to Lecture 11. Today we are going to talk about the counter-enlightenment. But first, let's just recap the essential paradigm that was formulated by those Enlightenment philosophes. It was harshly reductive and materialistic, and we know that they felt that was morally necessary in order to liberate humanity from the clutches of the church and the clutches of the divinely authoritarian king. And so the soul, if man had one at all, the highest part of man was from here on out to be associated with his faculty of reason. And the will itself, that human aspect in which we dispose of ourselves and make the best decisions about our lives, was, according to Locke, to be guided by that reason. So this new Enlightenment epistemology was developed from this Lockean empiricism that was very cautious, very skeptical. And in the hands of the philosophers, we know that this worldview became extremely materialistic. It became soulless. And the self, as we saw in the writing of d'Holbach and de la Mettrie, became just a machine, just a biologically based machine. And so the Enlightenment, in trying to formulate a new politics, a new society, a new vision and morality of the human condition, was forced to do so primarily by creating a new anthropology. Who is this man? Who is this new modern human being? Well, he is best likened to, best understood as a machine. And there we have an example of an 18th century automata, right? She can play with feeling because of mechanical springs and organs, can simulate feeling. Because feeling is just a program run on the hardware of your material body. Your soul is just an epiphenomena of your physical form. Rather than spirit or mind coming first, it's matter that comes first, and matter that from which all the other things of the universe derive. So that's materialism. The first principle in a materialistic universe is materialism. And spirit and matter and soul and everything else are just things that are byproducts, psychological illusions, if you will, of something more. We also get a new kind of epistemology. Remember, we've talked about that word. How do we know what we know? And this is something we emphasized earlier on Tuesday, but just to make the point clear, Locke gave us an epistemology that was reasoning, procedural, and based on sensory data. Your physical senses were very important because getting material information from the physical world was crucial for you being able to render a decent opinion, to come towards a refinement of what is true? What should we believe? So Locke was very much into privileging your physical senses. But he also guaranteed those physical senses. He said God would not deceive you. God gave you a sense that there's a red wagon there because there's probably a red wagon there. And if there isn't, then your senses are seriously impaired and we need to doubt. You need to be skeptical about your own subjectivity. So it's very cautious, very self-suspicious form of knowledge. But he also said, reason is an innate principle. Now, you don't have innate ideas. You were born with a black inky hole between your ears. But God did guarantee you reason. So it's this procedural, associationist philosophy that reflects on sensory impulses coming in little truths, builds up larger truths based on this empirical process, working from the ground up. What happens to epistemology in the hands of Newtonians who are not theistic like Newton, but deistic like Voltaire? They get rid of the presence, the loving presence of God. Well, who's going to guarantee reason? Who's going to guarantee that your senses are reliable. Does that mean you're just left with an inky black hole between your ears and you can't rely on your faculty of reason or your senses? This is dangerous. And this was exactly the dangerous epistemology we talked about in the early Enlightenment with Hobbes and later Hume. Remember what Hobbes said in the 1600s, 1665, his Elements of Philosophy. He came right out and said, Descartes has got it all wrong. Matter does not proceed from mind, right? It's not a res extensa that is extended out of this thinking thing. Mind is a function of matter. He also says, I know you're having thoughts, but you know what? Thoughts are just little markers. They're there to keep place of what? Your sensory impressions. So the real thing happening is not the thought, it's the impression made by the physical world that makes the thought. And remember, he also had this dangerous moral philosophy that said, you know, you really don't have free will. Since I've done away with this metaphysical principle of mind that Descartes had, you don't really have free will. You're totally determined really by a basic program. Your mind is going to do whatever is going to avoid the most pain and bring you the most pleasure. You are a profit-maximizing machine. Whatever works for you, whatever's good for you, you're duty-bound to do that. We see this idea further elaborated in the French Enlightenment. That's de Holbach and de la Mettrie. Take this idea and they run with it. Remember, Locke took this Hobbesian idea. Locke is writing in response to Hobbes, and he says, no, slow down, wait a minute. I agree with you, Hobbes. There's no innate ideas, but God gives us a reason, and God guarantees our senses. And the British Enlightenment runs with that down a middle way, reconciling man and his God. The French left standing out there on the open plain of some harsh, materialistic understanding of their reality. But remember again, they are far more besieged by church and state and cannot afford to make an ally of God or the king. And one last thing Hobbes says, well, since all you have are your sense impressions, that's the only real contact you have with the physical world, whatever is nonsense, whatever you don't sense, it's probably is nonsense, doesn't exist. So that's his sly little way of saying God is a joke. God is nonsense. So these are really important premises. You're building up, we talked about the encyclopédie, this wonderful tower of information. If man can stand on top of that tower of information, what a citadel, what a fortress for his freedom. Remember the Declaration of Rights and the revolution that was carried out in the name of those rights? What an accomplishment, what an achievement is made possible by this learning, but look at what's in the inside of it. To get this freedom, man has had to cast off his soul. It's a strange illogic of the Enlightenment, a strange, strange logic where man finds freedom by the loss of his soul. And it has a new epistemologist, David Hume, 18th century Scottish philosopher. He writes an enquiry concerning human understanding. Locke wrote an essay concerning human understanding. So he's clearly responding to Locke, except this time he's saying, in terms of those sense perceptions, you know, what I've noticed about sense perceptions is that anytime I'm without a perception, there isn't this faculty of mind, this reasoner, right? This innate reasoner existing. If I'm not having a perception, I actually cease to exist. So maybe there isn't a perceiver and the perceptions. Maybe when you stop perceiving, you stop existing. Because he says, were all my perceptions removed by death, I would be entirely annihilated. This is an Enlightenment philosophy that has led to a kind of egregious materialism in its quest for a greater humanism, secular, ethical, moral philosophies based on what causes human beings harm and what causes human beings pleasure. That seems very humane. But at the same time, this utilitarian notion of you're just a profit-maximizing machine leads us with a notion of humanity that is so mechanistic that as long as you kill a person and you do it humanely and you don't cause them any pain, because that's what the guillotine is about, right? It's not like that sloppy axeman whose arm gets tired and he manages to chip away at your skull before he actually gets to your neck. It's not that guy. The guillotine has no feelings. It precisely drops that blade 100, 200, 22,000 times without batting an eye because it does not have any. So, machine is going to be the state's new executioner, and a machine is going to be the state's new object of execution. There is a totalitarian logic that is inescapable to the Enlightenment. And people were beginning to sense that within all of this logic and reason, there was a great, mad, irrational storm of violence that was unleashed. And this is going to be the impulse, by the way, that is going to erupt in communist revolutions and in, obviously, Hitler's campaign against the Jews. So we're talking about this dangerous impulse of the Enlightenment that is based on reason, and yet in its totality, because it so reduces the nature of man to machine, there's something fundamentally dehumanizing about it, despite its great achievements in bringing us humanity, our humanity and our human rights. It's conflicted. It's only half the story. Well, now we're going to talk about the counter-Enlightenment. Thinkers and intellectuals who sense this great onrush of reason as something that needs to be addressed, that is actually presenting a dangerous idea to humanity, that is actually going to take man, and in their effort to free man from the cage of superstition and ignorance, it's going to cage man in the ignorance of reason. And why is ignorance also a product of reason? Well, if you think that reason isn't the only faculty we have, the only way in which we can produce authoritative knowledge, but you limit yourself to reason, then you're only using half your cognitive capacity. What kind of a humanistic revolution is that? You're going to have a revolution, a cognitive revolution, saying, I'm going to give you the equipment to think. I'm going to give you the equipment so you no longer have to trust the king or trust tradition or look to the Bible, that you can look between your own ears and you can free yourself from superstition and find yourself a truth. And yet the only mechanism you give this person is Lockean, inductive, empirical reasoning and your five senses. That is not the foundation for this emancipation of the human mind as seen by a new kind of romantic spirit, a new kind of romantic philosopher. We're going to introduce Goethe first. He's not calling himself a romantic yet, but he is seminal to this movement. He's looking at these scientists, he's reading the encyclopedia. It's massive, it's persuasive, but its conclusions are premature. He himself is one of the world's probably greatest IQs that ever walked the planet. A polymath, a geologist, a meteorologist, a botanist. He's studying optics. He's a poet. He's a philosopher. He's a novelist. He's doing it all. And he's opposing this reductive, quantitative, materialistic point of view that has been embraced by the philosophes. Now, I'm going to give you a quote of his. How difficult it is, he writes in his journal, to refrain from replacing the thing with its sign, to keep the object alive before us instead of killing it with the word. What does he mean by that? He is making a very modern indictment of science, a problem in science that has yet to be resolved. He's saying that, for one thing, when you do a laboratory experiment, the first thing you're doing is you're simulating nature. That's not really what happens in nature. Nature doesn't take place in a lab. And then what are you doing? You're using your 5 senses to observe it. You're taking notes about it. So you're taking this fragment of nature and further fragmenting it into signs, words, little bits of scribble on dried bits of paper, right? You're taking this lush jungle that is nature, and you're reducing it to scribble on a paper. What kind of a science is that? We're killing nature by converting it to words and symbols and then grinding it into our analytical brains. What he profoundly understands that the philosophes don't seem to get is that nature is not a machine. Philosophes, when you talk about this deistic clockwork universe, let me ask, if you wanted to make a clock, would you grow it from a seed? No, right? But if you want to grow an oak, wouldn't you plant an acorn? A clock is a machine. The oak is something organic to nature. Therefore, don't you think these two things are fundamentally different? So if you have this crummy science that's going to use this reductive, Lockean kind of quantifying reason, and you're going to try to understand nature with a mechanical process, you're going to be completely off. You're not going to understand what nature is. Nature's not a machine. You're not a machine. And there's something more to the way we reason than that mechanical inductive reasoning that Locke and the philosophes have recommended. Let me just make a point here, and I'm going to get back to it again when we talk about the Romantics. Why Locke can be seen as a mechanical reasoner. When you look at a machine and you take it apart, you see all of its different parts. And logically, you can reverse engineer it and put it back together. The machine is the sum of its parts. There's nothing extra there. What did Locke tell us to do when we try to reason towards greater truths? Start with the little bitty parts of nature. Make your little bitty observations the way you would in a laboratory taking notes, making small observations, discrete quanta of fact. Then take those discrete quanta of facts and assemble them to a larger fact, and so on until you've assembled a great principle of science. And what is the encyclopedia? Little quanta of fact that have been assembled into a great mound of learning based on mechanical reasoning. And using this mechanical reasoning, what is the model of nature they've come up with? A machine. So Goethe is cautioning the world, saying, nature's not a machine. We are not just mechanical reasoners. Here is what he sees the proper scientific discourse as, or the proper scientific epistemology or subjectivity. Here's another quote, and this combines the intuitive awareness with rigorous observation and thinking like Locke wants us to have. So he writes, the human being himself, to the extent that he makes sound use of his senses, is the most exact physical apparatus that can exist. That's very interesting. Now, he's way ahead of his time in this. He's anticipating Romantic philosophy. Because he's saying, you actually, as a human being, with your conscious subjectivity, are so exquisitely attuned as a product of nature to understand nature. You can actually trust your subjectivity because you are in some kind of deep sync with nature, just the way you are a product of nature. You share something deeper in your rapport with the senses. Locke's epistemology of the senses, remember, Locke says, imagine your brain is just a dark room. There's nothing in it. It's quiet, it's inky, it's dark. And you've got 5 windows that are your 5 senses. And if you want to let any light in, it's those 5 physical senses. So information can only come in little bits and only information of a physical nature. So that is a very limited understanding. However, Goethe is suggesting that there's something about your senses that are more profound, more intuitive, and a deeper rapport and understanding. But that's as far as he goes. It's going to take the Romantic philosophers to turn this insight of the possibilities of not just a scientific revolution, but a revolutionary science that incorporates the extent, the totality of human subjectivity into it. Interestingly enough, Goethe also publishes a novel. And at first, the plot of this novel is going to sound really strange to you. And it's a sensation. Everybody's not only reading it, they love it so much after they read it, they kill themselves. It is published in 1774. Runaway sensation. The hero falls in love with a girl. Of course, their love is star-crossed. He cannot have her. And he's pining, dying for love. There's nothing of greater importance to him in the world. And finally, he takes his own life for love. Well, if you understand this, say you've just read the Encyclopedia, right? You've just read that. And what you understand is that all you care about is getting fed when you're hungry and avoiding punishment if you're going to be, if you've done something wrong, that you're a little profit maximizer. All you really care about in a logical world, your instincts are to preserve your life, right? That's the most fundamental. If you want to understand the essential deterministic programming of a human machine in a mechanical world, avoid being killed at all costs. Therefore, when you have a young man who takes his life for love, I would say that just in that act, he has fundamentally refuted the entire towering edifice of the Encyclopedia. He has said, you can't reduce me to self-interest, because I've just killed myself. So that was hardly in my own interest. Therefore, human beings are irreducible ourselves for love. Our strongest drives, the stuff that really makes us tick, is not hunger and thirst and fear and all that stuff you materialists say. It's love. That's our most powerful drive. And you give me a mechanical interpretation of that. Well, somebody will, but just ignore that person. So you see, the fact that this novel is a huge sensation should tell us that the Enlightenment had gotten its message, its philosophy, its worldview across, and human beings wanted none of it. We have another important thinker of this period. This is to show you that modernity is complicated. Modernity is a dualistic narrative. It's both the heart and the head. A lot of times when we learn about the Enlightenment and modernity, we learn as if it's just the march of reason, as if there's just the Encyclopedia and the philosophes, and not Goethe and Rousseau and the Romantics. That's why we have the world we have today, and that it's not run by computers. This is the complexity of our heritage. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he's the doppelganger of Voltaire. He writes Emile, and he does something interesting with Emile. He educates, his idea of educating Emile is to take him out of the city, take him out of all of these brute structures of learning. Remember, according to Locke, reason is innate, but you got to work at it. You need to be educated and cultivated. Left to your own, you are just in darkness. God gave you the faculty of reason, but you need education to cultivate it. Some people are more reasonable than others. That's why there's a social hierarchy, according to the Newtonian harmonious universe, which was hardly egalitarian, right? So Emile is going to learn and evolve by cultivating his innate sense of goodness. He's going to go into nature to be instructed. Hold on, this is interesting. This is something different than what we've been saying up until now. We're not saying there are innate ideas. But Rousseau is getting at something. And he's getting at something that's very much part of this new discourse of natural philosophy. Remember, the whole way they pulled off this revolution and this new kind of political and social thinking is saying, we're going to look to nature. Nature is going to be our model. If it's not in nature, and I don't see a crown there anywhere, King, if it's not in nature, it's not the model. This is a very emancipatory idea. Natural rights, a lot of good comes out of that. But Rousseau wants to refine that principle and then let it include an inner nature. So if you go into the woods, you can use your five senses like the scientists and like Locke would tell you to. You can use your five senses to make small observations about what nature is. There's a stone over there, there's some grass over there, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also a different nature. You are part of nature. You're a creation of nature. Nature exists quietly within you. You can close your eyes and close your ears, and instead of inky darkness between your ears, there is a small, quiet voice of wisdom in nature. You are not alone. There is something in you that you were born with as a natural creation, as part of this universe. So this is, and as the philosophes and this sense of harmony, there is, even though I've been talking about it as materialistic and deterministic, there is a very benign view. A clock works. It is harmonious. It is lawful. And as you look at nature and you see its goodness, its lawful harmony, man can trust his inner nature to find truth, reason, goodness, harmony, answers. Answers he can get more intimately than he can by reading the entire encyclopedia. So Emil's not going to get educated reading the entire encyclopedia. That would crush his heart. That would just destroy his inner nature, right? Emil needs to go and bond with nature and let his internal wisdom be cultivated. He's not saying don't be instructed, but look at how much broader now this human being is. Rousseau is trying to give us more. He's trying to give us not just these external faculties, but he's trying to give us inner wisdom itself, all based on a natural philosophy. This is secular. Nobody's talking about God or religion. This is not dangerous. Letting the spirit back in, but not through the doorway of the church or the king. Just the way Descartes gave us an epistemology for Galilean mechanics and got rid of Copernicus and that scholastic framework of the church, and the way Locke, when he encountered Newtonian physics and thought, look what Newton is capable of understanding. I need to see if I can understand the way he understands things and create a philosophy of knowledge. And so Locke ends up providing Newton's science with an epistemology. We should be seeing a pattern here. Science comes with its own implicit or explicit philosophy of knowledge. So science is never just about matter and facts. It's also part of a much larger set of assumptions in which we create and infer moral and other conclusions, broader conclusions. And Frederick William Joseph von Schelling is going to give us an epistemology for the science that Goethe was struggling with and stumbling towards. And yet, this philosophy of knowledge is not going to be practiced philosophically. Naturphilosophy has a profoundly different understanding of nature. And naturphilosophy tells us that there is, that whatever that thing that is being sensed in nature, whatever that thing is that coaxes the oak coaxes the acorn into the oak tree. You can't see it. It doesn't have little spinning parts and gears. It is much more like a person, a creator, a subjective will. And so this vital will in nature, just 1 second. I do have this. Okay. Okay, so this vital will in nature makes us understand nature as something fundamentally different in the way we're going to approach it. Naturphilosophy tells us that if you want to get to know nature, you need to get to know it as a creative process, right? You need to get to know it as something that is not the thing itself, but the act of creation. Say you wanted to get to know an artist. And nature's now like a subject, like an artist. And then all you were going to look at was a pot on the artist's shelf. Is that any way to get to understand nature? Sure, nature works with matter as its medium. Schelling does not deny that there is this material atomistic stratum. But to try to understand nature as this fixed thing, right? This fixed thing is to confuse the act of creation with creation itself. Nature is not just the bottle of water, right? Nature is not just the thing, the chair that sits there. Nature is a process that is changing, growing, decaying. That's the thing you want to learn. You don't want to just learn about the chair. Matter is the fixed instance of creative action. You really want to be a scientist? You really want to be a philosopher? You really want to know what's going on beneath the surface? Beneath this superficial materiality. This is just nature throwing up forms. If you really want to understand nature, you need to understand creativity itself. Now, art is the creative process itself. Art is the only true and eternal organ and document of philosophy, which always and continuously documents what philosophy cannot represent. So, he is a philosopher, and he's coming up with Naturphilosophy. But he is saying that philosophy can't handle it. If you really want to get this deeper understanding, remember, ever since the pre-Socratics, philosophy is a rigorous, disciplined investigation of the laws of nature. Schelling wants a rigorous, disciplined investigation of the laws of nature. He wants to understand what it is, but he gets that it is not the object of nature that you must understand, but the creative process itself. And that can only come through art. And so we have in the Romantic movement an essentially philosophical enterprise undertaken in the realm of aesthetics. We've gone to a new place asking the same old questions. We want to understand the deeper nature of reality, a question you would only formulate, by the way, if you assumed there was a deeper nature to reality. So notice, this is rebutting the mechanical materialistic paradigm. And if you're rebutting the mechanical materialistic paradigm, you can't use the mechanical materialistic epistemology. You need to come up with a new way of knowing. And now, instead of these rational scientists and philosophers that have basically destroyed the country and gotten a lot of people smoked or decapitated, you are going to have the new hero, the romantic, the poet, the aesthete, the visionary. And here we have the Romantic Manifesto, a literary magazine published, the Athenaeum, published in 1798 by the Schlegel brothers, August and Friedrich, inspired by this discourse coming out of Germany of Naturphilosophy, saying the philosophy of life sets out from a single assumption. Life, not reason. That of life, or in other words, of a consciousness to a certain degree awakened and manifoldly developed by experience. Since it has for its object and purpose to make known the entire consciousness and not merely a single phase of it. Okay, if we remember that Lockean procedural reasoning that is trying to understand reality as a machine, as the sum of its parts, assembling little pieces from the ground up, it's never going to get there because we cannot understand life. Life is not a machine, so you cannot build it up. Nature is more than the sum of its parts. You want a new philosophy of nature, you're going to have to understand that you're going to need a mind that doesn't work from little bitty pieces. You want to ever answer these deepest, most fundamental burning questions that you've had since the 6th century BC? You're on the wrong path. Turn around. You need to focus on having a mind that can apprehend the totality, that can have a greater intuition, a sixth sense, a profound grasp of nature itself. This is what Rousseau was getting at. This is what Goethe was getting at. This is what the Romantics are going to categorically state in their philosophical manifesto. The purpose is to make known the entire consciousness, not merely a single phase of it. So again, when I make a piece of art, right, what I am capturing is not the object, not the vase, which takes up a specific form, but the form is not the eternally true thing. The form merely captures, in that instant, in that creative instant, the creative act itself. What I'm exposing by the process of art, I'm not creating a little knick-knack for your shelf. I'm not trying to match your couch with something ornamental. When art is created, what is being erupted is an objectification, a single instance of a dynamic process. Nature is not static. It's not all these fixed things, the chair, the table, the dog, whatever. Nature is actually a roiling, dynamic, changing, turgid engine of creativity that is spitting up things, killing, dying, decaying, all the time. And the artist has the guts to stick his hand into that chaos, into that creation, and pull out a form. And it should be a new form. It shouldn't be knocking off those old statues of antiquity. This classical modernity that we had in the 18th century based on rationality and reason was not the modernity we're going to end up with. Because that modernity, the modernity of the philosophes and the encyclopédie, their idea of art was creating a form that was classic and perfect and archetypal, knocking off pieces of, it became very popular to emulate structures and architecture from the classical period. So that's not creative, that's imitative. It's kind of Platonic in a way because it's presupposing there are perfect ideal forms, the world is static and harmonious. And we should reflect that in our architecture, we should reflect that in our poetry, we should reflect that in our laws. But look at this idea of nature that the Romantics have. It's a roiling, turgid, dangerous engine of change. And that is the thing that our consciousness has the capacity to get in touch with. So, turn of the century, philosophers are out, and the poets are now in. We want a subjective engagement of reason. Not that puny subjectivity of Locke, who's like, well, I'm not really sure, so I'm going to just hang back and get a few more facts and think about it for like 12 or 15 more years, and I'm going to consult my conclusions with other people, and if their conclusions are different than mine, then I have to reevaluate my own subjectivity. Okay, do you see what I'm saying? That's really the goal of that Lockean epistemology. What's its real goal? Is it subjectivity? It's objectivity. It wants you to consult yourself, to reason skeptically. It is an emancipation. It has given you individual rights to refer to your own cognitive authority, but it's so suspicious of the self and the subject. You could be wrong, you could be overwrought, you could be emotional, you could be pig-headed and uneducated, who knows? So it's really a form of subjectivity that ultimately values a kind of conformity and objectivity, which is good, right? If you're trying to create a world we can all share, a kind of consensus body that is scientific knowledge, that's part of the world we live in. We're a world that believes there is a kind of better truth out there, a kind of objective truth that maybe we can all agree on. Its project is modern science. We don't want scientists in one hospital thinking you can cure something one way and then them having a totally different idea in another hospital. We want there to be a consensus of truth. It's all empirical, it's all subjective reasoning, but it's ultimately producing objective knowledge. What are the Romantics saying? No way. What's the most important thing? Your experience, your truth. We're not trying to get at some out there shared objective reasoning. Because I'm, as a Romantic philosopher, they're actually saying, maybe I have a greater insight to the nature of reality than you do. This is the beginning of the gigantic sort of egoistic experience of the artist as a superior, more sensitive subject with greater insights into nature's mysteries and truths. It's the beginning of, right, the warfare between the two cultures, North Campus, South Campus. So rather than have to go through this mechanical procedure, this philosopher will turn inward, but he's going to turn deeper, deeper, deeper than his own senses, than those 5 measly senses of Locke. He's going to go so far deep into his senses that he pops out the other side into another dimension. How is he going to do that? The poets take it. This is going to be a fundamentally philosophical program acted through this aesthetic enterprise of poetry. But notice it's a brand new kind of poetry. Old poetry was really interested in rhyming couplets and stanzas. Mary had a little lamb, its sheep was white as snow. Everywhere that Mary went, the sheep was sure to go. That was what was important. And so form, again, as if there's a perfect platonic world out there in static harmonies. But notice, Mary had a little lamb. I'm not experiencing Mary sitting there or standing there on the beautiful pasture, smelling the experience of it, or knowing what's in her heart, or being with the lamb as it bleats desperately on its way to slaughter or whatever. Horrible. No, but you see what I'm saying? It's just like this very external experience of Mary as an object. But now look what William Wordsworth is doing, one of the premier, the great sort of romantic genius of his time. Here's a poem, Climbing Mount Snowdon. At distance not the third part of a mile was a blue chasm, a fracture in the vapor, a deep and gloomy breathing place through which the mountains mounted the roar of waters, torrents and streams. Just 1 second. He's climbing up the mountain, and in a way, like a Lockean, he's not seeing the whole mountain at once. He's getting impressions of it. Just a blue chasm there. He gets a fracture of a vapor. He's hearing the sounds of the thunderous water. He's feeling it's a deep and gloomy breathing place. And in this innumerable roaring with one voice, he's suddenly understanding through the gateway of the senses something so much more. He has a universal spectacle throughout with shape for imagination and delight, grand in itself alone, but in that breach through which the homeless voice of waters rose, that dark, deep thoroughfare had nature lodged the soul, the imagination of the whole. So through these pieces of our senses, if we cultivate them, if we are profound enough in the way we inhabit them, if we dilate the senses so that they bleed into a continuum of something greater, then perhaps this other dimension will come rushing in, as it did for Wordsworth. So remember how I just spoke about, I think it's Schlegel's manifesto, and he's talking about a consciousness that wants to know and understand the whole. You can. You're only given these 5 senses, maybe, but through the senses, they're very, very teeny and confined gateway, but they may be a keyhole through enough, if you cultivate not reasoning, reflection, and distance, and suspicion, and skepticism about your senses, but if you plunge into the sensorium, which is continuous, nature's physicality is continuous with nature's spirituality. Doesn't that mean that your physical senses are also going to be continuous with some spiritual aptitude that is ingrained in the senses? But only the artist can do this, can feel this. The artist alone can write the poem, and what the artist is doing for us with the poem is he's sharing his broadened sensory experience, his deeper appraisal of nature. If you want to know the transcendent truth that the philosophers have been after, don't read the Encyclopédie. Read William Wordsworth, he would say. That is the gateway to a higher truth. And here's another poem. How rich the wave in front impressed with evens, twilight, summer hues, while facing thus the crimson west, the boat her silent path pursues. What a strange poem. What is it about? It's not about a person or a historical figure or thing. It's about riding along these waves upon the Thames. It's about an experience which for some crass person, oh, I can't wait till I get there. Or Wordsworth, he uses this experience of just gliding upon the Thames to enter through that keyhole and then expand and expand and expand his awareness until look how much farther he gets. He goes out, he goes beyond, he sees how dark the backward stream, a little moment past so smiling, perhaps with faithless gleam some other loiterer beguiling. He's swept out of his own presence in the Thames. He's almost rushed out of his mind, and his mind has swept around and entered into this other loiterer beguiling, this idea of a universal consciousness, of a world soul, of a presence that connects us, that spills out into our senses, and we can again enter in to our senses and follow it back out, 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 beyond each other's minds to the very fringes of the universe, where the soul lurks, the imagination of the whole. Another famous poet of this movement, and one of my favorites, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This is an interesting story, and this is going to bring our romantic poets in contact with our scientists. A lot of people don't know this, but Samuel Taylor Coleridge was actually busily conducting experiments of consciousness with some kind of hardcore brain scientists of the day, Courtenay and I think Erasmus Darwin, and they were actually giving him laudanum and trying to see if it would stimulate any creative aspects, so produce altered faculties. So in the background of this poem, we have to understand that he is actually trying to understand the creative process, both as a psychological operation of the brain, but as a romantic, he's trying to see if is this psychological operation of the brain continuous with some deeper, more mysterious process of creativity itself, as in nature. Nature's great creativity that is not my own. So the story goes, he has just had himself some laudanum. He is reading from Pilgrim's Progress, and he's reading a few lines in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, and then he gets really, really tired and he falls asleep over the book. And as he falls asleep, almost from a dark cavern in his brain, words just come rushing up. A poem is constructing itself in his mind. The world of Xanadu is just unfolding. And he wakes up, and the words leap onto the page, and he's writing his 300 lines. It's exquisite. He can't believe it. The bell rings. He's interrupted. It's his drug dealer. No, the doorbell rings, and he's interrupted, and it's just the mailman, and with a package from Colombia. No, it's just the mailman, and he goes back to his table, and he sits down to continue this incredible poem, but the magic was gone. Whatever that sluice that had been opened that was just putting him in touch with this most fundamental, powerful cascade of creativity, nature's geyser was just ripping through his brain. Whatever that was shut down. And so if you're ever wondering why the second half of the poem is so bad compared to the first half, that is why. And this is just a little note that he wrote 20 years later. Because he was actually, it's either 10 or 20 years, he's actually traumatized by this event because there's a question. Was it his creative genius? Did the laudanum open up a gateway to another world? Is there something more than just material mind? Or was it just the laudanum? The laudanum was like a turbo gasoline. You pour it on your brain and it ignites, but it's just chemicals and chemistry and nothing truly magical about it. So he never comes to any conclusion. but he's sort of haunted by this experience and what it might mean. And that same question continues to haunt us today. I talked about these romantic poets being very, okay, so grumpy. I talked about these romantic poets sort of flirting with science and conducting experiments using mind-altering substances. They're also very involved with this kind of alternative forbidden science of mind, mesmerism. So there is an attempt, a desperate attempt for nature, philosophy, and science to converge, to reconstruct a totality, a whole project of man that studies the body, studies the mind, understands the spirit, understands nature and metaphysics without the church in a properly secular paradigm. They're trying to make this work. They got the poets and the philosophers and the psychologists working together. Now we have an interesting character who sort of sits at the beginning of this philosophy of mind. The philosophy of mind, which is going to become the alternative consciousness paradigm, the one which foregrounds parapsychology, depth psychology, all that study of telekinesis and levitation and mind reading, which today is actually, there's rigorous scientific studies being undertaken in PhD programs, mostly in England. But this is the beginnings of that new way of thinking about the mind. If it's not a machine, what is it? Franz Anton Mesmer. You probably recognize that word from mesmerism. So, he's an interesting character, and he brings us back to, we've got to flip back to some of these earlier questions that we were discussing in class. Questions of alchemy and the different sort of paradigm. Remember, right before we get this sort of mechanical truncation of the universe, it is an idea being formulated by Newton in a larger, more mystically inflected, alchemically enchanted worldview. So we have Franz Anton Mesmer. He's actually studies in Germany. And the Germans have not become quite so materialistic as the French. So it's a kind of softer program. He's probably having access to more of the kind of alchemical thinking that so inspired Newton. And he writes a treatise that is he writes his dissertation. And it's really, really an interesting dissertation. It talks about this magnetic attraction. It's almost an astrological understanding of the planets, and it talks about the planets influencing human behavior in a way that's astrological and hermetical, but the language of it is completely mechanical. He thinks that there's these small little pipelines with fluids gurgling through our bodies, because that's what, remember, Cheyenne was saying, and this was an idea of, is there some? I want to make sure there wasn't a mouse running around. Okay. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so this idea that the human being was a machine was often interpreted that we had little pipes in us and little gurgling fluids. Anton Mesmer thinks one of our gurgling fluids is sort of magnetic and mineral, and the planets have power to influence our bodies because of this impact that one large magnetic mineral has upon another. Astrological and quirky and alchemical, but clearly stated in a mechanical way. But we should understand that he's clearly reading a lot of alchemy and to have formulated this, but that he needs to make a properly mechanical statement or his dissertation advisor won't sign his thesis. So this is going to be an interesting way in which we're trying to connect the deeper underlying histories so that we've seen how alchemy was so important to the Newtonian formulations, and now alchemy is also going to come through this gateway of mind again and influence this new sphere of thought, which is going to be magic, right, in modernity. So he loves this idea. He goes off to Paris. It's the big happening city. And he starts this new medical practice where he believes, just like the planets impact us kind of magnetically and sympathetically, he can cure people's illnesses with magnets. So he gets a little shop open, and he starts strapping magnets onto people with, cramps and constipation and headaches and hysteria and nausea. And it's all going away. The magnets are curing it. In fact, magnet therapy is still a fringe medical practice today. So the magnets are doing things. But soon he's so popular, they're lining out the door. Everybody wants to be magnetized, and there's only so many magnets and so much time. So he decides to do things like magnetize big vats of bath water, or magnetize giant trees, so he can have his clients all hold onto a branch, and he can give a quick sort of mass magnetization therapy. This was a kind of suspect practice to many, but all of these people were getting cured, and so his reputation spread. And then the authorities find out he's having how many people sit in a bathtub together? And they're starting to think this is extremely hinky, this is extremely kinky, and wrong. And however, of course, the elites, Marie Antoinette was crazy for the idea, because it's an LA idea, and she was sort of, you can see, she was just thought this was going to be a kind of interesting, the celebrity thing to do at one of her salons and her parties. So Mesmer becomes this guest, this frequent guest at her parties, and he's magnetizing the elites left and right. So now this famous, this guy is becoming really famous. The scientists of the day aren't sure, is this a legitimate practice or isn't it? I mean, we got to get a hold of this before, the king is going to be magnetized. And science, remember, is very jealous over its authority, and it has certain procedures in place. So they decide that Mesmer must be subject to an inquiry, and they constitute, with our own Benjamin Franklin, who happens to be over in Paris trying to drum up support for the revolution. And he is given a commission to investigate Mesmer. And so the Franklin Commission investigates Mesmer, and he determines that, you know what? There's nothing going on here. The guy is a crook, a criminal, and his ideas are insane. How do they investigate him? They fake magnetizing objects. Like they say, oh, we've just magnetized the bathwater, and oh, we've just magnetized the tree. And then people had the same hysterical response and the same cure. So they're saying, there's no material cause of this. He couldn't possibly have he couldn't possibly have magnetized anything. It's not real. Notice what they're looking for, a material cause. They're willing to believe that you can take physical magnets and magnetize something. That's a mechanical thing. They're calling it a mechanical magnetic fluid, and that's okay. But when they prove this material, physical thing isn't there, as materialists, nothing legitimate is happening. So they shut Mesmer down. He gets driven underground. But he's still very popular, and his ideas had actually become even more problematic, because soon his follower, the Comte Puisséguer, is actually a military hero. He's a count. He lives on a big country estate, even though there is a formal injunction against practicing mesmerism in France. And remember, the French state is much more centralized, much more authoritarian, has its hands over the Académie des Sciences. So if they say don't do something, they're going to do it. And they also don't have the same kind of self-initiated, self-educating public the way they do in England. So they're able to stifle mesmerism pretty successfully on the continent. So the Comte de Puisséguer has to actually go into the countryside and conduct these experiments secretly. And his findings mark an extraordinary transformation in our understanding of consciousness. Puisséguer, he was a follower of Mesmer, and he understood, because of the Franklin Commission, that it wasn't the magnets that was doing it. But he knew from watching Mesmer that something was going on. And so he starts to hypnotize, or magnetize, rather, his patients. And one of his patients' name is Victor, and he's a peasant, and he's illiterate, and he has emotional problems. He's depressed and feeling sick all the time. And when Puisséguer attempts to magnetize Victor, something very strange happens. In his attempts to magnetize Victor, he triggers somnambulism. He actually triggers Victor going into an alternate state of mind and into a trance and sleepwalking. And then he starts to interview Victor in his sleepwalking state, and he finds out that Victor in this state is elegant, he's articulate, and he's able to share a deep understanding of exactly the true and fundamental nature of his problems. Apparently, there was a fight with his sister about a will, and it had been making him sick, and he had all of this awareness. And yet, when he came out of his magnetized state, he had no recollection. So Puisséguer conducted many experiments like this on Victor, and there's a couple of really important things happening. First of all, there had been many, many documented cases of sleepwalking, but this is the first time sleepwalking was actually flipped by a switch. The switch of that was the mesmeric process, which we now call hypnotism. It's not going to get that name until a little bit later. But Mesmer's act of this magnetization hypnotizes him. And so you can push a switch, and there's this alternate mental space. But what was so interesting about this alternate mental space was it was vast and commodious, just the way the Romantics imagined it. You don't walk into a diseased little cramped corridor of your brain when you fall into sleepwalking or a trance state. You walk into this vast place of wisdom, and all of a sudden Victor knows why he's depressed. He's speaking beautiful in a beautiful elite kind of knowledgeable understanding of himself. And also Puisséguer, after several studies with the different peasants on his estate, he comes to this very interesting and dangerous conclusion. It's dangerous to science, and it makes this Romantic science fundamentally incompatible with the science of the 19th century, but very Goethean, very fulfilling Goethe's desire that we have a more enlarged, subjective, and intuitive engagement with our object, that in order to understand the object, we actually need a more profound subject. Because the Comte de Puisséguer, he comes to the conclusion that part of the therapy for Victor was the good intentions of himself. That because he went to Victor with this willingness to heal him, he was able to focus not magnetic energy, but he was able to focus, almost sounds like a spiritual intention. But we have to put this spiritual intention, don't use that language. He's using the language of the mind. Whatever this capacity is, it's going to be secular, and we're going to talk about it in the context of the mind, not the soul. But look what they're doing. They're finding a way to bring this higher metaphysic back into the mind, and it is a moral metaphysic. And we are finding a way that the self is objective, is involved with the world outside, but also that the self can turn inward, that there is a deeper, inner, more mysterious self that will be disclosed through meditation, through art, through laudanum, through a walk in the woods, through hypnotism. We don't know what's going to trip the switch, get you over that gateway, but be assured that these Romantics and these Romantic types of science of mind are very sure there is something more, some greater mystery. And guess what? If you want to understand this mystery, we're not going to go to science, and we're not going to go to religion. This is an interior mystery of the self, of the mind, of some sort of vast inner reservoir of mystery, and it is boundless. We talk about separate spheres in this class of modernity. Science, religion are both public and institutional and profoundly authoritative. And then there's this wilder preserve of magic, this third sphere. And magic, in a way, is resurgent in this idea of this mysterious inner consciousness. Why is it magical? We have Puisegert saying, and the Romantics saying, and Goethe hoping, that if you, the humble human being, look deep enough, turn inward, you can contact the profound mystery that underlies all of nature. And you actually have the capacity with your mind, with your heart, to direct this mysterious physical power, whether Puisegert uses it to heal his mind the way Mesmer used it to heal others, to contact others, action at a distance, manipulating strange preternatural energies. Are they spiritual? Are they mental? Are they magnetic? Who knows? But they enchant the world, and the way you use them is with the power of your mind. Remember what magic fundamentally is. Magic is merely directing supernatural energy to be effective in nature. That's what magic has been since time immemorial, with the shamans, with the potions, with the incantations, with the alchemists. And remember what religion did. Religion wanted to restrict access to the supernatural, make it the privilege preserved of priests and theologians. But magic is back because it's somewhere in there, in your mind, and now people are exploring all these different ways of getting at it. But it's going to happen and unfold as a process in the private sphere. All right, so I think we were going to have a quiz. Hold, just before anybody does anything, TAs, is that okay? Okay, so, you didn't have one Tuesday. Okay, but I guess you weren't there, girl. You were not, Okay, you guys remember where to go? Okay, don't worry about it. You remember where to go? Just take your usual positions. I'll try to put the grid up.